Life began for me in San Francisco on the first day of spring in 1875. I was born at 18 Ridley Street, now called Debus Avenue, on the outskirts of Irish Town. That part of the city is still known as the Mission District. My father was born in Ireland. When he was still a youngster, the family went to New York, later moving to San Francisco, where my father became a marine engineer. By the time he died, he had held a chief engineer's license, unlimited, for many years. Mother was born in Eastport, Maine. All her brothers became sea captains on the Atlantic, and her sisters settled down in Massachusetts and Maine. Mother was more adventurous than her sisters. She wanted to go to California, and after saving money from her work as a dressmaker, she bought a steamer ticket for California. The Panama Canal hadn't been built then, and travelers had to cross over the isthmus to the other side to meet ships that were waiting for them. On the ship to San Francisco, my mother met the young chief engineer James Allen, and a year or two later they were married. I was the oldest of their three children. I attended the Mission Grammar School on Mission Street between 15th and 16th Streets. It was my parents' ambition that I receive a good education, Father would tell me. A man without an education is like a ship without a rudder. But I was restless, and school did not appeal to me. I guess I always did have the sea in my blood. I wanted to be a marine engineer like Father, and I wanted to give school books a wide berth. During vacations, I worked in the shop of the Pacific Coast Steamship Company. The superintendent was a small man, round-shouldered and very nearsighted. He'd stand right close to you when he was talking and hold his spectacles up to his eyes with one hand and squint at you hard. He had a quick temper, too, but there wasn't a more just man in San Francisco to work for. One day he sent for me. I was 15, big and husky for my age. As I went to his office, I wondered why he wanted to see me. Closing the door after me, I watched him reach for his spectacles. "Alan, do you want to go to sea?" "Yes, sir." My heart began to pound. I wanted to go to sea more than anything else. "How would you like to go as an oiler?" "Oh, fine, sir." I stood there shaking a bit while he sized me up. "Well," he snapped at last, "you be down at the dock at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning to go as an oiler for your father." That surprised me a whole lot because Father had always been dead set against my following the sea. Right after I knocked off work, I hurried home to tell my parents the news. Mother said nothing, but Father went right up in the air and told me he'd settle with the superintendent in the morning. He absolutely refused to take me with him. I was awfully worried. I packed my clothes for the trip and sat in my room waiting for most of the night. The next morning early, I reported as oiler. In a little while, the superintendent came. He and Father were old cronies. I could hear Father telling him exactly what he had told me the night before. When Father had finished, the superintendent talked in my favor for a while, but Father stood pat. At last, the superintendent turned away, saying that Father would have to take me anyway. Our ship was bound for Puget Sound in Washington, just outside the Golden Gate. We ran into a storm. I got awfully sick and made up my mind that if I ever got home safely, this would be my last trip to sea. But I soon recovered, and long before I returned to San Francisco, I considered myself a real sailor. However, Father didn't hold that view. He was stricter with me than with the others in the engine room, and at the same time expected a good deal more from me. Naturally, I resented that and couldn't help being rebellious at times. So when we returned home, he promptly fired me. But I was regarded in the neighborhood as something of a young hero, and that made me more eager than ever for another voyage. I was soon off again, sailing on a big English tramp, the San Benita, carrying coal from Comox, British Columbia, to Oakland for the South Pacific Railroad. But the crew seemed to resent a boy holding a man's job, and they made it pretty miserable for me, so I left. It was a lucky thing. A few months later, probably in 1891, the San Benito ran on the rocks at Point Arena, California, a total loss, and a great many of the crew were drowned. My next ship was the Queen, which ran summer excursions to Sitka, Alaska. I signed on again as an oiler. When the season was over and we returned to San Francisco, I thought I had been gone for a long, long time. I was in a big hurry to get home. Market Street at the time had cable cars, and that day they seemed to me to be moving terribly slowly. I jumped off long before my stop and ran the rest of the way. Mother listened patiently to my chatter and fed me apple pie while I told her of my travels. The next day was payday. In those days, oilers received $40 a month. I was pretty proud when I pocketed my 3 months' earnings, the most money I'd ever had. I took the money home to Mother, and I shall never forget the pleasure that gave her. She would confide to her friends about it, but she never mentioned my borrowing a good part of the money back again. I wanted to work on the Pacific Mail Company ships running to China and Japan, and when I was about 17, I finally got into the company as an oiler on an old steamship running to Panama. After several trips, I was transferred to the Peru bound for the Orient. 17 days out of San Francisco, we arrived in Yokohama. I was wild to take in the sights. 5 of us went ashore together, and it felt good to walk on solid ground again. We were immediately attracted by the rickshaws and hired some for sightseeing. It gave me a strange sensation to be hauled around by another man trotting like a beast of burden. How those fellows could travel! They took us through all the main streets and showed us bazaars and parks. To me, Yokohama was the prettiest city in the world. We went to Nagasaki and Kobe, but were not allowed ashore. I could look over the side at those ports and watch the coolies, both men and women, as they coaled ship, passing small baskets from hand to hand, staging alongside. They worked very rapidly and were paid 20 cents a day. We went to Hong Kong next, then Honolulu. I liked the China run and made the trip 3 times. Then I went back to work again in the shop of the Pacific Coast Steamship Company, along with 2 other men. The shop had its regular mechanics, and we 3 were put on as extras during the busy season. The superintendent was the same man who had given me my first chance to go to sea. Every Saturday at 4:30 in the afternoon we were paid. When the superintendent was going to lay men off because the work had slacked up, he would wait at the gate for the men on their way home. Then he would call a man over to one side, get out his spectacles, and tell him the bad news. His brother, who was a typical old Irishman, and I were great friends. When the superintendent called the first extra man, we knew what was in the wind. "Wait till you see what he does with the other one," the brother suggested to me. So I waited. The second extra man was hailed. Then the superintendent's brother told me to jump over the back fence and go home until Monday morning. I wasted no time about it. Monday morning, on the dot of 7, I was back in the machine shop. I hunted around for an old valve, put it in a vise, and was polishing it up with a piece of emery paper when the door suddenly opened. As was his daily habit, the superintendent had come in to see what was going on. I knew without looking that he was headed straight for me. "Allen," he began, "where were you Saturday night?" "I was at home, sir." "I know damn well you were at night, but where were you at 4:30? "I was right here, sir." "Well, I didn't see you." "Why, sir, I passed you right at the gate." He fumbled for his spectacles, then he leaned forward, staring clean through me. "I'll be goddamned," he exclaimed, and walked away. I kept on polishing the valve and worked in the shop a couple months longer. One day, not long before I turned 19, the superintendent said to me, "There's a vacancy on the steamer California, and you will go down there tomorrow morning, and no more jumping over the back fence." It was just about then that Mother took sick. Father's favorite brother was very sick too. On a Sunday morning, Father and I took my uncle to the hospital. That night, Mother had a bad time. Father and I stayed up with her, taking turns fanning her. The following day, the California was due to sail at 10 a.m. for Portland. I left home an hour before sailing time. When we got to Portland, the chief engineer called me to his quarters to tell me my father had died. I felt that there must be some mistake. Father had been fine when I left home. No, I said to the chief, you mean my mother. No, he told me, I mean your father. You have my permission to return home by railroad if you want, but the California will arrive in San Francisco just a few hours after the train. I'd advise you to stay on the ship. The news of Father's sudden death was a bad shock. When the ship reached San Francisco, I found that the Masons had kept him in their vault so that I could see him before the burial. That was in April 1894. 2 months after that, Mother died, and 2 weeks later, my uncle died. That broke up our family completely. I don't think a man could have loved his mother more than I did. After her death, I lost my bearings altogether. Just went plumb to hell for a while. 1 year to the day after Mother's death, on June 1st, 1895, I sailed away to the Arctic Ocean. I was standing on the old Pacific Mail Company dock in May 1895 when a friend of mine who was a chief engineer came along. During our conversation, he asked me how I'd like going to the Arctic for 3 years on a whaler. I said I wouldn't mind. Well, he said, come on down to the company's office. You can sign up. We went to the office and I met Josiah Knowles, an officer of the Pacific Steam Whaling Company. He asked me if I had been whaling before. No, sir. Have you been to sea before? Yes, sir. Then he asked me what ships I had been on and what positions I had held. He wanted to know if I drank liquor. No, sir. When he asked me if I would like to go whaling, I said I would. We are signing men now, he explained, for whaling trips of at least 3 years, but no longer than 5. And I will ship you as a utility man. This, you understand, means that we can change you to any vessel in the fleet wintering in the Arctic. He brought the articles, the contract between a seaman and the company that hires him, and I signed. The sailing time was set for noon on June 1st, 1895, and I was to sail on the old 3-masted steam schooner Jeannie from what was then called the Oil Works dock. The Jeannie was commanded by Captain Mason. The Jeannie was a whaler's tender, and she was used in the summer to take coal and supplies to ships wintering in Herschel Island. Herschel Island, which is in the Arctic Ocean, is part of the Yukon Territory. The whaling ships were there to catch the bowhead whales, and it was easier for the ships to winter in the ice than to go back and forth every year from San Francisco to that part of the Arctic. Of course, the ships were very sturdy and they were specially outfitted. They had only been spending winters at Herschel Island since 1890. The Jeannie also took men north to replace those who had completed their time on the wintering ships. On this trip, the Jeannie would be carrying 12 whalemen, 4 engineers, and 2 sailors as replacements. I arrived at the dock about 10:30 a.m. The area was crowded with people wishing bon voyage to their husbands, sweethearts, and friends. Many of the men who were to sail away, and their friends too, were under the influence of liquor, and before the old ship left, there were several fistfights. A little after noon, we got away, and we ran into a good stiff northwester outside the Golden Gate. I am sure, however, that 75% of those aboard who were ill were suffering from other things than seasickness. The weather continued bad for several days. Not long after it moderated, we entered the Bering Sea. Shortly after that, we were told by some of the old whalemen that they smelled the ice. Next morning, when I came on deck, the ship was stopped. The ice had entirely surrounded us. Like many others aboard, I thought we were in a jam that could not easily be gotten out of. But the ice soon moved away. It was my introduction to something that was to be an important factor in much of the rest of my life. Among the men going to the up on the Genie to join the different ships were about 20 young men who had been signed on by boarding house keepers. Now I'd better tell how these men were hired. To begin with, a company appointed captains to the various ships. Usually the company allowed the captain to choose his own crew and his chief engineer. Whaling ships usually carried 5 officers, or whalemen, 5 harpooners, a chief engineer and his assistant, a steward, a cook, 2 cabin boys, 2 firemen, 2 sailors. And 24 sailors. Of course, these numbers varied a bit depending on the size of the ship. The officers, harpooners, engineers, and steward were usually hired long before the day of sailing, but with the sailors it was different. 4 or 5 days before sailing, a captain would go to some of the keepers of sailors' boarding houses and notify them that he wanted to ship a crew on a certain day at a particular shipping company's office. And if the keepers had any men, they should have those men down there at the appointed time. At the office, the captain would look the men over and take the ones he wanted. The boarding house keepers would pick up men along the waterfront, sailors or not, and have them at the appointed spot at the agreed time. In this way, many men were shanghaied aboard whalers. The captain would pick out enough men to complete the crew. These men were each advanced $50, which was given not to the men, but the boarding house keeper the day after the ship sailed. In return, the boarding house master was to provide food and shelter until the ship left, and also to supply each man with blankets, a mattress, and a bag of clothing for the cruise. The mattress would turn out to be straw mattress, known as a donkey's breakfast. Usually on the day of sailing, the boarding house master saw that most of these future sailors were under the influence of liquor. They wouldn't know what was in their clothing bags, and at that time they didn't much care. I have seen some of them open those bags. On top would be a pair of dungarees, but underneath, petticoats and other things that were of no use at all to a sailor. While we were on the Genie, all of us who were replacements were really just passengers. Once we joined our whaling ships in the Arctic, we would be working on a percentage basis, but temporarily we weren't getting any pay. Men on a whaling ship, including the captain, were not paid salaries. They were promised a percentage of the catch. This percentage was known as a lay, and of course the captains got the largest. When a man signed the articles, it was agreed that if the cruise was successful, the company would allow him a certain price for his share of the whalebone, his lay. For us going north on the Genie, our lays were far in the future. Meanwhile, the 20 replacement sailors were being worked hard. As an extra utility man, I didn't have much work to do, and I was treated all right. The 20 sailors, what with getting no pay and having very hard work, refused to work the ship any longer. Among these men was one named Fred, who had been to sea before and was a real sailor. He knew that these boys were making a mistake, that they would be forced to go on deck and get back to work, and their refusal to work constituted mutiny. Fred advised the men to that effect and told them that they had better turn to. Just about the same time Fred was talking to the sailors, Captain Mason went into the forecastle where the men were living. He had a 2x4 about 4 feet long. With it he drove them on deck, all 20 men, I guess. Fred had been in his bunk. He told the captain he was sick during the night and that the mate had given him permission to stay below. But the captain ordered him on deck just the same. When Fred got out on deck, he put his knife, the kind all sailors carried, in its sheath. The captain said, "Leave that sheath knife off and throw it on the deck." Fred answered, "I'm a sailor and I have always carried a sheath knife, and I'll not leave it off unless you put that stick down." Fred was a bigger man, bigger than I am, and I am over 6 feet tall. Mason was a big man too. "I'll put the stick down," Mason said, "and you throw "Your knife on deck. I can lick you anyhow." Mason walked up to Fred and struck him, and the fight commenced. Fred proved too much for Captain Mason. Then Mason stood over, picked up his stick, and struck Fred several blows over the head. Fred tried to protect himself by putting his arms up, but Mason struck him again, and Fred fell to the deck, bleeding badly. Captain Mason left him there and went aft. I was standing there the whole time, so I know that was exactly what happened. Just then, a little Irish engineer named Murphy, who belonged to the Genie, came along. He said to me, "Come with me and we'll get a basin with some water and bandages and we'll try to fix this man up." We bandaged Fred and got him to his bunk. He was seriously hurt. Shortly after that, we arrived in Port Clarence, north of Nome, where the old revenue cutter USS Bear was at anchor. Some of the crewmen asked for permission to call the doctor from the Bear for Fred. Permission was refused, but one night 2 of the sailor boys stole a canoe belonging to some natives who had come aboard and paddled over to the Bear to notify the doctor. The doctor came immediately and suggested to Captain Mason that Fred be taken aboard the Bear for treatment. Mason refused until he could see Captain Healy of the Bear. Captain Healy and the doctor came the next morning, Healy going below to the captain's cabin and the doctor going to see Fred. On returning from Captain Mason's cabin, Healy told the doctor it wasn't necessary to take Fred aboard the Bear. The doctor was to take care of him where he was. Well, Fred was a tough sailor, so he recovered all right, but it took a long time. Meanwhile, the rest of us were looking forward to the day when we could get away from Captain Mason.